Well, don't be upset. Come on, come on, come on. Don't get that. Okay, so here's the thing. In that book back there, they were talking about coinage in the early days of the United States, or actually the America, when the Pilgrims first came. So when my ancestors met my ancestors, what happened was that silver and gold, but mostly silver, was considered to be very desirable when it came to coinage. And so the understanding of having something silver and then being able to melt it down and then using silver as like a currency was very important or popular. It's considered to be normal for the guys who came over on the Mayflower. But the people they met, they didn't mess around with silver like that. They used shells. They used a specific kind of shells. As a matter of fact, they would get these shells and they would make these things equivalent to buttons and beads. And they had this jewelry, and they would wear this jewelry. It wasn't just jewelry, it was ceremonial garments. And the number of beads and the way they were arranged and the manner they were presented was a demonstration of influence. Let's put it this way. The way it was described is it wasn't just about power. It was almost like an insignia in some ways. It's like, if you think about like the uniforms today, I imagine it's something like if you think about the uniform today and you got a patch, or you got like medals or ribbons. Maybe you got like that cord thing and it comes around. These things all mean something, so you assume if you know what it is and you see somebody wearing something like that and you see the insignia or you see the way that it's done in that manner, you recognize that they may come from a certain place, but they may also be capable of doing certain things. And especially, I would imagine if you're dealing with a bunch of different tribes that may have their own languages or may come from different places geographically, and so they have access to different kinds of things, and you're trying to identify or communicate a way to see what's compatible, and what may be useful to them or what might be desirable to them. It may be something different than what's useful or desirable to you. And so this is kind of what was happening is in the early days, the first coinage laws, or the first coinage, actually, the first currency between the guys from the Mayflower and the people who were already here, that was what was considered. And there's actually very sophisticated rendition by an early colonial, specifically in Massachusetts, that the first coinage law actually had to deal with something that was presented in conjunction with the engagement between the indigenous people and the people who had come over on the Mayflower and the later expeditions. So the colonists, as they were called, also had to figure out, well, what are they going to do, understanding that they got silver, some, and that they have access to places that have minerals that they would consider to be the kind of things they want to get access to, so that they can create what they consider to be things for exchange as value. But the people that they're engaging with don't really recognize it like that. There's other things they desire, and there's other things they would actually prefer to have over these little pieces of silver, including that have these designs on them because they melted them down. They took some stamp and put the stamp on there, and it's some design, and it might mean something to the people that put the stamp on there, but when you give it to them, they're like, well, trying to figure out how to. It's going to be really, really hard to put a hole in here, so I can make it a button for. I mean, literally, buttons were important, and actual buttons, actual usable buttons, were actually considered. And he says it. Actually, having a usable button that would be able to keep a garment together was considered to be a more valuable currency than whatever they were doing with those little pieces of silver and whatever was being addressed internationally in terms of what the merit of the value of that silver was. So I thought this was very much of a consideration to me, because in some ways it was like it's very intense to think, well, why did certain kinds of metals at those times have that kind of use value? And then if you start doing things like what was the corollary, right? Like the Species Act, like what the Queen Anne Species Act, and the later uh, bills that were being presented, and the later information was being presented by the British Crown and contested even within Parliament in Britain around coinage and the concept of, or rather, specie, as they call this, specie. This understanding that even if you had a particular weight of silver, the fact that it would come from the particular place and wanted the place to be acknowledged as the place of origin would give it a different value. And Spanish silver is not as, say, silver from Belgium. There's a different value, even though it's silver. And then within that, there's even a weights, a composition in terms of what would be considered to be the weight of a silver versus something else it might be mixed with, or something it might be evaluated in regards to as a unit of measure. And the manners in which they talked about the proportions, actually, there's other aspects in there to talk about the proportions of the metals that are allowed to be used in each coin. That is very, very significant, because we're talking almost about a form of sacred numerology, and it may have had different implications regarding the different places from whence it came. For instance, in Thomas Jefferson's exegesis on the metric system, or what we call the metric system today, when he was talking about things like farthings and pences, and like trying to figure out how to calculate money, especially with the kind of conversion that they were trying to effectuate in the United States with, or in the early colonies with what they had, and then determining what they called Spanish coinage, because the Spanish system was based on tens. It was based on a indicator of tens, and so it wasn't just about the mathematical convenience of being able to add or subtract as part of 10. There was actually a lot of other intrinsic values that went into the metrics and the ways the metrics fit together, that also had to do with the proportion on the weighting that came into being with the combinations of the metals. So it was actually very, very significant. And the early system regarding coinage, and the early system regarding the various considerations that went into what was coinage, what constituted coinage, what was appropriate coinage, what was inappropriate coinage, was hugely important. It would seem to have taken a lot of consideration, and in some ways it wasn't just about money or demonstrations of wealth. There were all kinds of intrinsic things, etheric things, spiritual things that were communicated in the contemplation of what was acceptable coinage, and then the negotiation with others about how to attempt to get them to acknowledge your coinage, as well as attempt to figure out a way to translate what the value of their coinage was when they were working with you, or trying to exchange or transfer something about what was inherent in the value that was being represented with the coin. But then you get into another situation, which is that the indigenous people, the people who were here, they didn't do that. They didn't do metal coins. They did something different. They did beads. And it was a specific kind of bead, a specific kind of shell that was very sought after. So when they had access to it, which sometimes they were able to get, especially after there was communications with people that were involved in the maritime sector, they were able to get it in enough of a volume that the people they were working with considered it to be very important. Now, something in the last couple of years, actually, I think the first time I confirmed this is when I was downtown in Dallas, when I used to be able to get into the radiographs, or not the what's it called? I keep calling them radiographs. What are they called? The microfiche, the microfilm. And so when you get into the microfilm, one of the first things I found were the tobacco stocks, and that the government has tobacco stocks are government issue. At least they were specifically, the ones they had that I saw were from the 90s. I looked through 3 years worth of the full catalogs on tobacco stocks that were issued by by the government in the 90s. And there is a very, very, very sophisticated, comprehensive scheme on indexing that also goes into classification. And it's one of the things that is concerning to me specifically now that they're talking about legalizing marijuana. I think that somebody saw the system that got set up in regards to the later classifications of tobacco stocks that were government issued and government backed, and the way they weighted them, and the way they specifically broke them down by national origin. And in the course of breaking them down by national origin, they also talked about the weighting. It's very similar, for instance, to the Specie Act, right? Going back to the days of Queen Anne, and what was being negotiated and what was being attempted for addressing, especially in regards to the way that the British Crown responded to what the colonists were trying to do and what the early Americans were trying to do in regards to working with other people. That what there is definitely a systematology. It's comparable to what was exposed or what was part of those early laws attempting to regulate what would be considered acceptable coinage or acceptable exchange rates regarding coinage between the different countries. And I was very certain when I saw it. I was like, wait, somebody's looking at this. This was before they started doing all of these. It was right before the passage of the Farm Act, actually. And I'm like, wait a second, is somebody thinking about this because they're going to try to do this with marijuana? Are there going to be government issued stock? Is there going to be government issued stock that's tailored to marijuana? And then, all these other things that were happening with the 420, including with the World Bank. I was like, wait a second, this is concerning to me. The reason it's concerning is because of the culture related to marijuana. And there's no reason not to talk about this because in somebody's lexicon, in somebody's context, they believe that they can make some sort of comparison, that they can equivocate what the primitive needs of the early indigenous people in the United States who encountered the people from Europe that were first coming here. That they can equivocate now trying to give them marijuana or give them stock issues based on marijuana with all the things attendant in it. I know that's what you just gave me, and I know that's what you just gave me because that's exactly what happened in Honduras. You wanted to give them hamburgers. You didn't want them to know anything about their constitutional rights to protect themselves against illegal search and seizure, right? I mean, they're going to be happy with hamburgers. That's America. At least that's the America they're allowed to get. And then later, if you try to give them something else, then they're going to get pills, right? Because that's what you give America, right? And if you want what America gets, then that's what America gets, right? Yeah, no, right? Because the whole problem with legalization of marijuana, and especially the whole problem with allowing for this false paradigm of identifying how cultivation of marijuana also allows for taxation that will then bring revenue to a state. Doesn't talk about the actual resources that the land needs in terms of regeneration in order to be cultivable. Secondly, it doesn't talk about actual food need and water needs that go into cultivation of marijuana, especially if you're allowing for outdoor agricultural production. C, it doesn't talk about the other factor, which is indoor cultivation, which also has to do with the drain on electric grids, as well as water resources in consideration of the specific kinds of techniques that go into the hydroponics aspect, as well as the regulation of time and temperature and light exposure in order to assure against one kind over another. For instance, there's more females than males, right? Oh my gosh, the temperature changed and now there's more female than male. Right, I know. Exactly. Well, you need to do things to manipulate the environment in order to produce the results that would give you an optimal outcome, especially based upon the fact that there's a difference when you're growing a marijuana plant and have a male plant than when you have a female plant, which then is going to turn into a discussion of what the end product is going to be, right? If you're talking about CBD oil, that's different than if you're talking about medicinal marijuana. It's also different if you're talking about legalization of recreational marijuana consumption. And then ultimately, what also goes into this is consideration of acclimation to a different cultural paradigm associated with marijuana cultivation, which has to do with hybridization. It also has to do with the fact that hybridization is meant to be almost a recreational activity that also lacks permanency and is intended to be a recurring thing that, while it may occur in cycles, also involves artificial manipulation in order to exacerbate extremes in terms of the impact it has on affecting sensory perception, i.e., you get that strain, you do that strain right, you give it to somebody, it's potent, they smoke it, they get the high they want, but they're not going to be able to be consistent with it because that is part of not only the culture, but the physiological realities of engaging with consumption of marijuana. Your body builds up a tolerance, and unless you're going to do something to artificially bioengineer people so that they do not develop a tolerance to particular mind alterations of sensory perception and or biophysiological responses to ingestion of a specific strand or strain of marijuana. That's going to happen. That the potency is going to wear down. They're not going to have as much of a high. And then attendant with the other aspects of the culture, which are about sensory gratification, there's also going to be a psychological stressor that goes into chasing the high and not getting it. So all of the things you're trying to compensate for and justify actually require huge amounts of maintenance, huge amounts of resource investment that is taking resources away from other places, and a major, massive cultural paradigm shift that also takes time and attention away from other factors that need to be focused on, like what you just did now, right? Like what you just did now. Because there's also the need to guard oneself against being assimilated into or being allowed to be absorbed into being dominated by the marijuana culture. And that also goes into, well, are we talking about trying to genetically modify, creating GMO marijuana? We have GMO agave now. As a matter of fact, there was just a news report today about somebody, he defrauded people $2 million worth of tequila. Well, what kind of tequila? Are we talking about the tequila that comes from the agave plants that take 10 years to grow? It takes 10 years for an agave plant to mature in order to produce what is necessary so that it can be distilled into tequila, as is understood to be the requirements for the distillation of tequila. Well, they got GMO agave. Do you know this? They got GMO agave. It only takes 5 years. You can get the agave to make tequila of a certain standard in half the amount of time. Is that true? But then again, that also goes into the culture. There's a completely different cultural paradigm that comes with having a field that you have to cultivate and understanding that there is a particular kind of crop rotation and maturity on the crop. She's not going to be ready for 10 years. But you want her in 5. You want her in 2. She's not going to be ready for 10 years. Well, if we give her this, she'll be ready in 5. No. Because then what ends up happening? Well, you end up not only destroying the culture that came before it, but then what does that do with the rest of the crop, which is part of what they've been dealing with, right? That certain crops are allowed to create a dominance in the ecosystem, and the necessary processes of cross-pollination allow for those dominant artificial strands to go in and infiltrate what are naturally occurring strands or naturally occurring products or naturally occurring provisions of the earth. And then what ends up happening? Well, now we got all kinds of other situations, which also goes into another culture, right? Because somebody's seed, or you cross-pollinated with something, and oh my goodness, it mixed with mine. Wow, we got this corn, it looks this color. I imagine in some point in time, if I had a field and I had some corn, and it was supposed to, or I had corn, it was supposed to be nice and white. It was some nice white corn. And I tasted it. It was really sweet. And I liked it. And I knew that, and I got the seed, and then the next year came around, I grew the corn. It was nice and white. It had a particular sweetness. And then the next year, I'm looking at my crop, and I'm like, well, it's not growing the same. We're going to have to look at this. So I have to check this out. What's going on? And then you come back out, and they're like, well, that's not what I put in there. Right? And then you're like, riding around. Maybe you got, like, your bicycle. Maybe you got your horse. I don't know. Your donkey. Maybe I got my donkey. And I'm riding around. I'm like, wait a second. That corn looks a lot like the corn that showed up in my field. Maybe I should go talk to the guy. Is he going to say, well, my seed ended up in your field? Well, then I get to claim your entire field. And by the way, you owe me royalties on everything that happened this season. And by the way, I'm owed royalties every other season subsequent to this. Then you're going to get into another problem because I'm probably going to come back with a shotgun. But it doesn't have to be that way. I just be like, oh, excuse me, some of your seed got in my field. That just seems logical to me. I could be wrong. Now, if on the other hand, it is a premeditated policy of trying to infiltrate fields that have that nice, sweet white corn and try to change the color scheme, because if you can identify via visual testing that there has been an alteration in a particular set of hues regarding the actual end product, then you can say that it resembles characteristics associated with another product line, and that that product line is patented and is identified as proprietary information and property associated with this company. It happens to own the adjacent land, and then within a certain range has already determined that it has a right to first access or a right of first refusal on anything that ends up happening within that area adjacent to the land it literally owns. Well, you don't. Wait, what are you talking about? We've been doing this for, all these years. We've had this farm. Here's my deed. Yes, but you don't understand. There were changes to the law that happened. Well, I mean, I paid my taxes. Yes, but in the course of paying your taxes, there was other rezoning that happened. That's what they're doing. I mean, you don't even have to tell me literally and show me the literal law. I wish you would. Actually, wait a second. Didn't I ask to see the actual bill? Didn't I say, can you send me a copy or a version of the actual law now, as well as what your proposed revisions to the law are? I did actually. I actually did that. That's how crazy I am. You know what I found instead? Yeah, what I found instead was a book, an international law book that was talking about mining concessions, that also included concessions on gas and oil, that went back 20 years, but that also discussed 10-year terms regarding concession awards. That you can buy a concession and that a certain percentage of it has to be in the name of or under the ownership of somebody that is an owner of property connected to the area where the concession is, not necessarily the owner of that land itself. That is a citizen of Honduras, but that you can have access to it for 10 years. And that within that 10 years, if it does produce, there are certain matters at hand that would allow for an automatic resumption of your claim to that concession. And if it doesn't produce, well, then there's a strategic process that can be engaged. If for whatever reason you have it for 10 years and it doesn't produce, right? Well, that's not what I was asking about. I wasn't asking about that. I was asking about something else, right? I was asking what are the specific laws around agrarian reform and the concerns that are being had here with understanding that there's not enough market access because you keep getting strong armed by narcos. And there's not enough capacity for you to be able to get your product to market and get the kinds of prices you need because you also have distribution to places in other countries that are willing to pay the prices and want to pay the prices and want the quality you're producing specifically and are willing to and have whatever is necessary for you to be able to transport it to their area without having to pay the kickbacks to the narcos. And in the meantime, you've got other problems, including problems with violence and including environmental problems. And so the government comes in and offers you this GMO seed free for a year and you grow a crop, but you're not able to get any seed. You're not able to get any seed from the crop you grew. But they have some distribution that they'll give you, but they don't want to pay the prices and they tax you. And not only do they tax you, these other people who have no right to tax you. And then by the time the next year comes around, you don't have any seed from the year before. And now they want to charge you for the GMO seed. And you're not allowed to grow unless you use the GMO seed. Is that what we're talking about? Yeah, see, now those those government issue marijuana stocks don't look so good anymore, do they? Right? You could hope that somebody, has something somewhere else. Right? I'm sorry. What were we talking about? What was the original topic? We got so off track. I'm so sorry. Is this what happens? I mean, did you put some other seed in with mine and now it's not what I wanted to do originally and you don't want it? Well, we don't want it. I mean, what we wanted is what you had before. But I mean, that's not what we're getting. No, it's not. It's not. You're not getting what I had before. Right? It's a big problem. Because I don't want to give you what you're telling me that I'm supposed to be giving you. I'm not giving you marijuana. You've destroyed the entire fucking planet with your drug addiction. And you didn't listen. This is what's so disingenuous. I heard them. I heard them in English. I heard them in Spanish. I heard them in Mexico. I heard them in Honduras. They both said the same thing. They didn't need to spend as much time as I just spent. We're 24 minutes in. We're going on 25 minutes in. What did they say? If you don't deal with your demand, then you don't really have anything to offer us. Your demand to consume drugs is killing us. And even if you legalize it, then what you're going to do is you're going to make it even more dangerous because the black market economy associated with it is still going to be trying to get cheaper drugs into your country than what you can get legally. They said it in English, they said it in Spanish. They said it in 2 countries that people in the United States right now clamoring to express their civil rights to free, unfettered access to marijuana with no consequences said that they considered to be part of their commitment. Are you saying that in the last 5 years that people that were saying very definitively, after having lived through campaigns of strategic murder of their political leadership, that when you talk to them about the only thing you want to talk to them about when it comes to drugs, which is, we know there's a problem with drugs and we know there's a problem with narcos, but we really like smoking pot and we don't want it to be illegal. And we, want to help you, but we're not going to give up smoking pot, right? So you don't need us to. You don't need us to give up smoking pot, right? And what they said is, if you don't give up smoking pot, you really don't have anything to offer us. So the whole rest of this conversation is about what? I'm sorry. Were you on the same phone call I was? Let me ask you a question. Were you surveilling the phone call I was on? Was your lawyer on the phone call with us? They said it was recorded. They didn't mince words. They weren't talking about, can you give us better stock options on your government issue? I'll tell you why. Because you guys already fucking tapped out their fucking Class A's, didn't you? You already got their good stuff. And you probably enjoyed it on pot, right? And you want more. What if they don't have any fucking more? Is that what we're getting to right now? Yeah, shit. They're not going to be able to give us the fucking quality. We worked this whole fucking scheme because that's what we wanted. And yeah, now you're not going to be able to get that. You got something else. Are you saying you don't want it? You want me to try to fortify it? You want me to better market it? I mean, is that where we're at? Because I had all of this stuff here. But then you tried to fucking make that shit about fucking figuring out a way to, what are you going to do? Is it going to be more exciting or titillating if you're on fucking pot? Never mind.